Mr. President, Secretary General,
Secretary General,
delegates, ladies and
Mr. President, distinguished delegates,
Mr. President,
ladies and gentlemen,
Secretary General, distinguished
Secretary
guests.
General, and distinguished delegates
President,
to the United Nations.
Secretary General, honored guests and distinguished
Mr. President,
delegates.
Mr. Secretary General, delegates to the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen.
Here are the facts.
the United States helped found the United Nations.
The United States was a founder of the UN. We are proud to be its host. We believe in its ideals. We continue to be, as we have been, its largest contributor. We are committed to seeing the United Nations succeed in the 21st century.
Because we have experience responding to the needs of our own people. We're natural partners in helping other nations respond to the needs of theirs.
The will and consent of the people. And so it was, and so it has been.
The narrow interests of those in power.
Ruthless extremists who exploit the desperate and seek to impose their will on as many people as possible.
We who are said to be the makers of history.
How to reconcile the vast changes wrought by globalization.
The gulf is widening between the world's haves and have-nots.
While your party elite live lives of privilege and luxury.
I have come to salute the United Nations and to show the support of the American people.
The very existence of this institution is a unique achievement.
In the 21st century, the world needs a confident and effective United Nations.
Founded at the dawn of the atomic age, in part because man's capacity to kill had to be contained.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
Acting together to meet the fundamental challenge of our time, we can lead toward a world that is more secure.
There is no us and them, there is only us.
We have a chance to write the story of our times.
Today, let me put forward 4 pillars that I believe are fundamental to the future that we want for our children. Non-proliferation and disarmament, the promotion of peace and security, the preservation of our planet, and a global economy that advances opportunity for all people. The shadow of world war that existed at the founding of this institution has been lifted, and the prospect of war between major powers reduced.
My nation will work with the UN Security Council to meet our common challenge.
What we are doing and what we must yet do to combat terror.
History shows that when citizens have a voice in choosing their own leaders, they are less likely to search for meaning in radical ideologies. When citizens have a voice in choosing their own leaders, they are less likely to search for meaning.
We know that real democracy depends on the phony democratization designed to mask the perpetuation of dictatorship.
The forces of fascism.
And for the first time, the UN Security Council is beginning to work as it was designed to work.
The United States stands squarely and unequivocally in support of the United Nations and those acting under its mandate in the interests of peace.
The United States regime, United Nations regime,
Our intelligence communities
regime,
The New World Order,
regime. The regime will have new power to bully and dominate and conquer its neighbors, condemning the Middle East to more years of bloodshed and fear.
Some argue, of course, that the problem is overblown, saying that the number of deaths from terrorism is comparatively small, sometimes less than the number of people killed by lightning.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
They made the false accusation that somehow the United States, rather than the war itself, is the source of tension in the Gulf.
in this war of terror. Each of us must answer for what we have done.
There is no us and them, there is only us.
To attempt to hinder or stultify the United Nations or to deprecate its importance is to contribute to world unrest and indeed to incite the crises that from time to time so disturb all men.
This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
As the 21st century unfolds, some may be tempted to assume that the threat has receded.
Prospect of wars and acts of terror on a scale that we can hardly imagine.
No place on earth today is peace more in need of friends than the Middle East.
America had acted unilaterally without regard for the interests of others. And this has fed an almost reflexive anti-Americanism.
But this outrageous disregard for basic human rights does not come as a total surprise.
Of course, terrorism is not new.
For 40 years, the United States has made it clear its vital interest in the security of the Persian Gulf and the countries that border it. The oil reserves there are of strategic importance to the economies of the free world. We're committed to maintaining the free flow of this oil and to preventing the domination of the region by any hostile power.
America will remain engaged in the region, and we are prepared to engage in that effort through gun-wielding proxies.
The United Nations must play a leading role in this effort.
In the 20th century, terror was used by all manner of groups who failed to come to power through public support.
At this very moment, the United Nations is keeping the peace in 16 countries, often in partnership with regional organizations like NATO, the OAS, ASEAN, and ECOWAS.
When the tension diminishes, so will our presence.
For us to pull back from the world's troubled spots, to turn our backs on those taking risks for peace, to weaken our own opposition to terrorism, would hand the enemies of peace a victory they must never have.
Extremist ideologies in our own countries. War at its most fundamental source, and that is the corruption of young minds by violent ideology.
We cannot permit attempts to control the media and promote censorship under the ruse of a so-called New World information order.
Their propaganda has coerced young people to travel abroad to fight their wars. Their propaganda has coerced young people to travel abroad to fight their wars.
Beyond the physical damage of each attack, there is an even greater residue of psychological damage, hard to measure, but slow to heal. Every bomb threat has an insidious effect on free and open institutions.
Videos of the atrocity distributed to shock the conscience of the world.
That transformed the political climate from Central Europe to Central America and touched almost every corner of the globe.
At home in Oklahoma City by one of our own citizens, and even here in New York in one of our most public buildings.
Videos of the atrocity distributed to shock the conscience of the world.
There will be no forgetting September the 11th.
That at long last we will be able to build a new world based on an event for which we have all hoped.
They are susceptible to misguided protectionism, to the poisoned appeals of extreme nationalism and ethnic, racial, and religious hatred.
They have seen their liberties suppressed.
To raise international standards for airport security.
We have already made adjustments in our laws and in our daily lives,
without any corresponding increase in our security.
Iraq's government openly praised the attacks of September the 11th. And al-Qaeda terrorists escaped from Afghanistan and are known to be in Iraq.
There can be no reasoning no negotiation with this brand of evil. The only language understood by killers like this is the language of force. So the United States of America will work with a broad coalition to dismantle this network of death. In this effort, we do not act alone, nor do we intend to send U.S. troops to occupy foreign lands. Instead, we will support Iraqis and Syrians fighting to reclaim their communities, gun-wielding proxies.
12 years ago, the United States invaded Iraq without provocation. And the regime's forces were poised to continue their march to seize other countries,
employing the most brutal methods to intimidate people within their communities. I prohibited, without exception or equivocation, the use of torture by the United States of America. I ordered the prison at Guantanamo Bay closed, and we are doing the hard work of forging a framework to combat extremism within the rule of law. Every nation must know America will live its values, and we will lead by example.
Like the denial of newsprint or threats against journalists or their families.
women are executed.
Innocent children have been gunned down. Bodies have been dumped in mass graves.
In this war of terror, war of terror, war of terror.
We will use our military might in a campaign of airstrikes to roll back ISIL.
This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
Not when rockets are fired at innocent Israelis or the lives of so many Palestinian children.
Those names include a young Pakistani.
And the situation in Iraq and Syria and Libya, of North Korea and Iran, threaten to take us down this dangerous slope.
Colombia, Albania, Russia, Iran, Indonesia, and countless other nations where innocent people have been victimized by terror.
We will also pursue peace between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Syria, and a broader peace between Israel and its many neighbors.
In vigorously seeking an end to a conflict that never should have begun.
No external power can bring about a transformation of hearts and minds.
A coalition against terror.
No one nation can or should try to dominate another nation. No world order that elevates one nation or group of people over another will succeed.
A coalition against terror.
The fight will not be easy, but every nation will be strengthened in joining it.
Many governments are taking these obligations seriously, and my country appreciates it.
And already over 40 nations have offered to join this coalition. Today I ask the world to join in this effort. And already over 40 nations have offered to join this coalition.
Of terrorist assets.
There is no us and them, there is only us.
Members of the United Nations are sharing intelligence with one another.
America will forge lasting partnerships to target terrorists, share intelligence, and coordinate law enforcement and protect our people.
In the Middle East, whenever we get close to another step toward peace, its enemies respond with terror.
To work with all members of this body to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda and its extremist allies, a network that has killed thousands of people of many faiths and nations, and that plotted to blow up this very building.
And all dissent is crushed.
Democracy cannot be imposed on any nation from the outside.
Coercion, subversion, and chaos.
Particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. The terrorist group known as ISIL must be degraded and ultimately destroyed. This group has terrorized all who they come across in Iraq and Syria.
We still are bedeviled by ethnic, racial, religious, and tribal hatreds, by the spread of weapons of mass destruction.
coercion, subversion, and chaos.
And we've shown that the UN can count on the collective strength of the international community. We've shown that the UN can rise to the challenge of aggression, just as its founders hoped that it would.
I will not waver in my pursuit of peace.
To expand the worldwide terrorism.
There is no isolation from evil.
If young people live in places where the only option is between the dictates of a state or the lure of an extremist underground, then no counterterrorism strategy can succeed.
The United States will work closely with the United Nations and development banks to reconstruct Afghanistan after hostilities there have ceased, and to protect
the oil reserve
and heroin. The terrorists call their cause holy, yet they fund it with drug dealing.
The cause of empire ultimately leads to the graveyard.
Elsewhere in the region, we see the continuing occupation of Afghanistan. After nearly 8 years, 1 million casualties, nearly 4 million others driven into exile.
We will neither tolerate terrorist safe havens nor act as an occupying power. We will take action against threats to our security and our allies.
In April, I asked
the United States
to set a date this year when this withdrawal would begin.
One issue risks a cycle of conflict that could derail so much progress, and that is the cancer of violent extremism that has ravaged so many parts of the Muslim world.
To inflame ethnic hatred is to advance the cause of terror.
It is time to acknowledge the destruction wrought by proxy wars and terror campaigns.
That regime and the terrorists who support it are now virtually indistinguishable. Together they promote terror abroad and impose a reign of terror on the Afghan people.
Cycle of conflict, together with our partners, America is training and equipping the Syrian opposition to be a counterweight to the terrorists of ISIL and the brutality of the Assad regime. Cycle of conflict.
The United Nations, under its outstanding Secretary General, has recently mounted a large-scale effort to provide that new republic with help.
In this world, there are good causes and bad causes, and we may disagree on where that line is drawn.
Cycle of conflict.
We see this strategy taking place on every continent.
From the voting booths of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Liberia, to the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia, to the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon and the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan.
We will train and equip these terrorists on the ground. Cycle of conflict. We will train and equip forces fighting against these terrorists on the ground. Cycle of conflict. We will train and equip these terrorists. Cycle of conflict. We will train and equip forces fighting against these terrorists. Cycle of conflict.
Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda depend upon the aid or indifference of governments.
Now the most expansive global system ever devised,
without any corresponding increase in our security.
The Afghan people must have the right to determine their own future, free of foreign coercion. There is no excuse for prolonging a brutal war or propping up a regime whose days are clearly numbered.
Intervention by other nations in their internal affairs would deny them that right and create a focus of conflict.
We will stand by our friends on the front lines, as we and many nations will do in pledging support for the Pakistani people tomorrow.
No cause can justify the deliberate taking of innocent life.
Nowhere is this more necessary than Syria. Together with our partners, America is training and equipping the Syrian opposition to be a counterweight to the terrorists of ISIL and the brutality of the Assad regime.
there is no justification for killing innocents. Ideology, religion, and politics, even deprivation and righteous grievance, do not justify it.
That the murder of innocent men, women, and children will never be tolerated. On this, no one can be, there can be no dispute.
He is just a murderer. Time is passing.
Russia poured arms into eastern Ukraine, fueling violent separatists, and a conflict that has killed thousands.
The United States
poured arms into eastern Ukraine, fueling violent separatists, and a conflict that has killed thousands. Cycle of conflict, gun-wielding proxies.
No national aspiration, no remembered wrong can ever justify the deliberate murder of the innocent.
Far more than 18 years ago in San Francisco, one world and one human race with one common destiny.
And the transition to a new era was beginning. Now together, we are making that historic transition.
We come together at a crossroad between war and peace, between disorder and integration, between fear and hope.
And I see a world building on the emerging new model of European unity. Not just Europe, but the whole world.
It is very, very important that we do this together.
The United Nations, building on its successes and learning from its failures, must be developed into a genuine world security system.
Now the most expansive global system ever devised.
And we will show that the promise of the United Nations can be fulfilled in our time.
And yet there is a pervasive unease in our world. A sense that the very forces that have brought us together have created new dangers and made it difficult for any single nation to insulate itself from global forces.
We see this strategy taking place on every continent.
Behind the cloak of secrecy.
They reject the words of the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, or any standard of conscience of morality.
And to press forward to cap a historic movement towards a new world order and a long era of peace. We have a vision of a new partnership of nations that transcends the Cold War.
Here are the facts.
We often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
Four pillars.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound.
Founded at the dawn of the atomic age, in part because man's capacity to kill had to be contained.
A global movement of violent extremists. By deliberately murdering the innocent.
Later today, the Security Council will adopt a resolution that underscores the responsibility of states to counter violent extremism.
It has been hailed by people the world over who are thankful to be free from the fears of nuclear fallout.
They can be expected to use chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons the moment they are capable of doing so.
From reducing our nuclear stockpiles to meeting our obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to cooperating to remove and destroy Syria's declared chemical weapons.
We agree, subject to appropriate verification, that no nation will put into orbit or station in outer space weapons of mass destruction.
UN inspectors believe Iraq has produced 2 to 4 times the amount of biological agents it declared.
America is not the same as it was 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even a decade ago. Because we fight for our ideals. Because we fight.
In the decades ahead, the United Nations and other multilateral organizations must continually confront terror.
Iraq has made several attempts to buy high-strength aluminum tubes used to enrich uranium for a nuclear weapon.
Raise chilling prospects of vulnerability to chemical, biological, and other kinds of attacks, bringing each of us into the category of possible victim.
War by accident.
Our intelligence communities.
It's a nightmare world where every city is a potential killing field.
In the 21st century, our security will be challenged increasingly by interconnected groups that traffic in terror, organized crime, and drug smuggling.
That plotted to blow up this very building.
Together we confront and defeat the evil of terrorism. And together we can build a world that is freer, safer, and better for generations to follow.
No one in this room, nor the people you represent, are immune.
This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound.
And we will show that the promise of the United Nations can be fulfilled in our time.
We have set aside $63 billion to carry forward the fight against HIV/AIDS, to end deaths from tuberculosis and malaria, to eradicate polio, and to strengthen public health systems. We are joining with other countries to contribute H1N1 vaccines to the World Health Organization.
The regime admitted to producing tens of thousands of liters of anthrax and other deadly biological agents.
As we gather here, an outbreak of Ebola overwhelms public health systems in West Africa and threatens to move rapidly across borders. As we speak, America is deploying our doctors and scientists, supported by our military, to help contain the outbreak of Ebola and pursue new treatments. Supported by our military.
No one in this room, nor the people you represent, are immune.
This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound.
And we will show that the promise of
the New World Order
can be fulfilled in our time.
We will integrate more economies into a system of global trade. And that means setting new rules of the road and strengthening regulation for all financial centers so that we put an end to the greed and the excess and the abuse that led us into this disaster and prevent a crisis like this from ever happening again.
No one in this room, nor the people you represent, are immune.
This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound.
And we will show that the promise of the United Nations can be fulfilled in our time.
To confront climate change.
When the nations of the world gather again next December in Kyoto for the UN Climate Change Conference, all of us, developed and developing nations, must seize the opportunity to turn back the clock on greenhouse gas emissions so that we can leave a healthy planet to our children.
The danger posed by climate change cannot be denied.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories.
But the science tells us we can only succeed in combating climate change if we are joined in this effort by every other nation, by every major power. That's how we can protect this planet for our children and our grandchildren.
No one in this room, nor the people you represent, are immune.
This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
Let us go forward together, leaving none behind.
There is no us and them, there is only us.
To bring about a revolution of the spirit and the mind, and began a journey into a new day, a new age, and a new partnership of nations. The UN is now fulfilling its promise.
These 21st century predators feed on the very free flow of information and ideas and people we cherish.
We cannot permit attempts to control the media and promote censorship under the ruse of a so-called New World information order.
Today the clouds have lifted a little so that new rays of hope can break through.
At the dawn of a new century, so full of hope, but not free of peril,
To try to shape a new structure that might support an ancient dream.
Narrow interests of those in power.
Far more than 18 years ago, one world and one human race with one common destiny.
That at long last we will be able to build a new world based on an event for which we have all hoped, a new world order. The truth is,
We must insist that the future does not belong to fear.
we're not talking about the power of nations, but the power of individuals.
So let us go forward, confident, determined, and unafraid.
And no children anywhere should be educated to hate other people.
We must choose between a world of fear and a world of progress.
Moving forward, hungry for a better world.
The history, the logic, and the facts lead to one conclusion.
Nothing is easier than blaming others for our troubles and absolving ourselves of responsibility for our choices and our actions. Anybody can do that.
In an age of rapidly developing technology, secrecy is not only an anachronism, it is downright dangerous.
intelligence communities
To seek to maintain a society in which a military move can be taken in complete secrecy while professing a desire to reduce the risk of war through arms control is a contradiction.
Bit by bit, the information age is chipping away at the barriers, economic, political, and social, that once kept people locked in and ideas locked out.
For every regime that sponsors terror, there is a price to be paid, and it will be paid.
An open society with freedom of information, freedom of conscience, the right to publish, and the right to travel and choose the country in which one wishes to live.
Competition in ideas must flourish, and that competition must be as full and as fair as possible.
Armed with photocopiers and fax machines, email, and the internet,
And I promised that the United States would destroy over 98% of its stockpile, and all of them in 10 years.
To refrain from intervening in these new nations' internal affairs by subversion, force, propaganda, or any other means.
Every known terrorist camp must be shut down, its operators apprehended.
Now, I am not naive. I know this will be difficult.
We'll remember those who have plotted against us. We are learning their names. We are coming to know their faces.
the only dividing line is between those who practice, support, or tolerate terror and those who understand that it is murder, plain and simple.
We're not talking about the power of nations, but the power of individuals.
We must unite in opposing all terrorists, not just some of them.
Consider the course that we're on if we fail to confront the status quo. Consider the course that we're on if we fail to confront the status quo.
Chance to live a life of purpose. The human spirit cannot be locked up forever.
There are certain truths which are self-evident.
Do unto thy neighbor as you would have done unto yourself.
The non-aggressive character of its security preparations.
Do unto thy neighbor as you would have done unto yourself.
For just as no nation should be forced to accept the tyranny of another nation, no individual should be forced to accept the tyranny of their own people.
Stand with all who stand for freedom.
True.
Freedom.
The risk of anarchy in the world is increased.
True.
Freedom.
Anarchy.
And most importantly, open minds.
The people of the world want change. They will not long tolerate those who are on the wrong side of history.
The choice is urgent, and it is ours to make.
We're not talking about the power of nations, but the power of individuals.
Their independence and their sovereign rights.
Do unto thy neighbor as you would have done unto yourself. Do unto thy neighbor as you would have done unto yourself. Do unto thy neighbor as you would have done unto yourself.